Right now, as you are watching this, the most dangerous chess game on the planet is unfolding between Washington and Beijing. And folks, I am not exaggerating when I tell you that Xi Jinping just pulled off one of the most calculated power moves we have seen in modern geopolitics. While the United States is knee-deep in a military conflict with Iran, burning through resources and global goodwill, China's president is sitting back, watching the chaos, and quietly stacking the deck in his favor ahead of a summit that could reshape the entire global economy. If you think this does not affect you, think again, because what happens in the next few weeks will determine the price of everything from the food on your table to the car in your driveway to the phone in your hand. So buckle up, because this story is far bigger than the headlines are telling you. And before we dive in, do me a huge favor. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and share this video with someone who needs to understand what is really going on behind closed doors. Trust me, you are going to want to hear every single word of this. Here is the breaking news. Bloomberg just reported that top United States and Chinese trade negotiators are expected to meet in Paris by the end of next week. We are talking about Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, and on the Chinese side, Vice Premier He Lifeng, one of Xi Jinping's most trusted economic lieutenants. This is not just another diplomatic handshake for the cameras. This meeting is the final preparation round before President Donald Trump flies to Beijing for a multi-day summit scheduled from March 31st to April 2nd. And the stakes could not possibly be higher. Now here is where things get really interesting. The topics on the table in Paris reportedly include a massive Chinese purchase of Boeing aircraft, potentially up to 500 planes worth tens of billions of dollars, commitments from China to buy American soybeans, the explosive issue of Taiwan, and the future of fentanyl-related tariffs that the Supreme Court just blew up. Each one of these issues by itself would be a headline grabber. Together, they represent the most consequential trade negotiation of this decade. But let me tell you what the mainstream media is not emphasizing enough. Xi Jinping is walking into this negotiation with more leverage than he has had in years, and is not even close. Let me break down exactly why. First, the Supreme Court just handed China a massive gift. On February 20th, 2026, in a 6-3 decision, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as IEPA, does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. That single ruling wiped out the entire foundation of Trump's tariff strategy against China. The so-called fentanyl tariffs that hit Chinese imports? Gone. The reciprocal tariffs that targeted dozens of countries? Struck down. We are talking about more than $200 billion worth of tariff revenue collected since 2025 that importers are now lining up to get back. The Council on Foreign Relations put it perfectly when they said the ruling recalibrates how and with what credibility the United States can wage its trade wars. Now Trump moved fast. Within hours of the Supreme Court decision, he signed an executive order slapping a 15% global tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. But here is the catch, and this is crucial. Section 122 tariffs can only last 150 days without congressional approval. That means they expire on July 24th. So China knows that the clock is ticking on American tariff authority, and they can afford to be patient while Washington scrambles to find new legal footing. Think about what this means at the negotiating table. Before the Supreme Court ruling, Trump could threaten to jack up tariffs to 145% on Chinese goods, and Beijing had to take that seriously. Now, the president's favorite economic weapon has been taken away by his own country's highest court. Xi Jinping's negotiators know this. They have studied every page of that ruling, and they are going to use it. Second, And this is the part that really changes the game. The United States just launched a major military operation against Iran. On February 28th, the United States and Israel began coordinated strikes on Iranian cities, including Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, and Kermanshah. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in the strikes along with dozens of senior military and political officials. Iran retaliated with missiles and drones hitting targets across the Gulf region, striking at Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. Oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical energy choke points on Earth, are being disrupted. Now, what does this have to do with the trade talks? Everything. China is the world's largest energy importer and the biggest buyer of Iranian oil, purchasing roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports. With the Middle East in flames, energy prices are spiking, shipping lanes are under threat, and Beijing is facing real questions about its own energy security. China's Foreign Minister Wang, he called the strikes on Iran and the killing of Khamenei, quote, unacceptable. Beijing condemned the operation as a violation of the United Nations Charter and basic norms of international relations. Russia and China together called an emergency session of the UN Security Council. But here is what is fascinating. Despite all of that harsh rhetoric, China is not cutting off trade talks with Washington. In fact, the Paris meeting is still on track. Why? Because Xi Jinping is too smart to let emotions drive strategy. As one analyst from the Atlantic Council pointed out, China has every incentive to stand aside and position itself as a voice of stability rather than an active participant in the conflict. Beijing is playing the long game, and the long game right now means getting the best possible deal out of a distracted, overextended America. Think about it from Xi's perspective. The United States is simultaneously fighting a military campaign in the Middle East, dealing with the fallout of a Supreme Court ruling that gutted its tariff authority, and trying to prepare for a presidential summit in Beijing in less than a month. American attention, resources, and diplomatic bandwidth are stretched thinner than they have been in years. That is exactly the kind of environment where China thrives at the negotiating table. And there is a third factor that people are overlooking: the Busan precedent. When Trump and Xi met in South Korea back in October 2025, analysts widely agreed that the outcomes were modest at best. Chinese soybean purchases were roughly equivalent to past years. China's crackdown on fentanyl exports had been promised before but never fully delivered. The TikTok sale was not completed. Brookings Institution called it a temporary truce that would not provide long-term stability. But what that meeting did accomplish was set up this moment. Both leaders agreed to reciprocal state visits in 2026. Trump would go to Beijing, and Xi would potentially visit the United States for the G20 summit. And here is the key insight from the Atlantic Council that I want you to really sit with. China is using this extraordinary lineup of pre-scheduled 2026 meetings to box Trump in and force a degree of predictability in the relationship. The Chinese are strategic, and their diplomats are strong. They know exactly what they want ahead of these summits and exactly where their red lines are. There is still no indication that the U.S. side has the same strategic clarity. That is a devastating assessment, and it comes from one of America's most respected foreign policy think tanks. Beijing is playing chess while Washington is playing checkers, and the board is tilting in China's direction. Now, let us talk about the specific deals on the table, because the details matter enormously. The Boeing deal is potentially the crown jewel of the upcoming summit. Reports have been circulating since mid-2025 that Chinese airlines are in talks to buy as many as 500 Boeing aircraft. If finalized, this would be China's first major Boeing purchase since 2017, when trade tensions first erupted during Trump's first term. The U.S. ambassador to China, David Perdue, has publicly said the deal is, quote, very important to the president, to Boeing, and to China. Boeing has been frozen out of the Chinese market for nearly a decade. During that time, Airbus swept in and grabbed massive market share. Chinese airlines also placed a 500-plane order with Airbus that was completed in June 2025. And let us not forget, China's own homegrown competitor, Comac, is slowly ramping up production of the C919, which directly competes with the Boeing 737. So Boeing needs this deal desperately, and China knows it. That gives Beijing enormous leverage to extract concessions in other areas. Then there are soybeans. During the February 2026 phone call between Trump and Xi, the Chinese president indicated willingness to increase soybean imports, which is a key crop for Trump's electoral base. We are talking about commitments of 20 million tons for the current season and 25 million tons for next season. Soybeans are not just an agricultural product here, they are a political weapon. China buys more American soybeans than any other country, and purchases go directly to farm states that Trump needs for the 2026 midterm elections. She knows this. He has used the soybean card before, cutting purchases during trade disputes and restoring them when he wants to signal goodwill. It is leverage, pure and simple. Taiwan is perhaps the most sensitive issue on the agenda, and the one most likely to cause fireworks. During the February phone call, she reportedly told Trump that Taiwan is, quote, the most important issue in U.S.-China relations, and warned of the need for, quote, extreme caution regarding American weapons shipments to Taipei. Beijing sees Taiwan as part of China to be reunited by force if necessary. The fact that Taiwan is even on the table alongside Boeing and soybeans tells you how intertwined economics and security have become in this relationship. Some analysts have worried that Trump might use Taiwan as a bargaining chip, offering to slow arms sales in exchange for better trade terms. The administration denies this, but the mere fact that Taiwan, Boeing, and soybeans are being discussed in the same meetings should make everyone in Taipei very nervous. And then there is the fentanyl tariff question. The Supreme Court ruling specifically struck down the fentanyl-related tariffs that Trump imposed on Chinese goods starting in February 2025. These tariffs started at 10% and eventually climbed to 20% on top of other duties. Now that the legal basis has been pulled out from under them, the question becomes what replaces them. Trump has already moved to impose a 15% global tariff under Section 122, but that is a temporary measure. The administration is also looking at launching new investigations under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which was the original legal basis for tariffs on China during Trump's first term. But those investigations take time. Months, potentially. And in the meantime, China's negotiating position only gets stronger. So, where does all of this leave us heading into the Paris meeting and the Beijing summit? Let me give you my honest assessment. Xi Jinping is in the strongest negotiating position he has been in since the trade war began in 2018. The Supreme Court took away Trump's most powerful economic tool. The Iran conflict is draining American attention and resources. China's economy, while facing its own challenges, is not in crisis mode. And Beijing has had months to prepare a carefully orchestrated summit in its own capital, on its own terms, with its own choreography. On the American side, the pressure is immense. Trump needs a win before the 2026 midterms. Boeing needs the China deal to survive its turnaround. American farmers need soybean exports. And the administration needs to show it can still project economic strength even after the Supreme Court clipped its wings. That creates a dangerous dynamic where the United States might be willing to make concessions it would not normally make, just to get something it can call a deal. The Chatham House analysis put it best when they noted that China is playing a long game that it hopes will see it emerge having achieved its long-term objectives at the expense of the U.S. Beijing does not need a flashy announcement. It needs incremental wins that compound over time. A Boeing purchase here, a soybean commitment there, a vague promise on fentanyl, maybe some loosening of AI chip export controls. None of these individually looks like a major concession by the United States. But taken together, over time, they shift the balance of power in China's favor. And here is the wild card that nobody is talking about enough. China's response to the Iran situation could become its own form of leverage. Beijing purchases around 90% of Iran's oil exports. If the Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted, or if Iran's regime collapses and oil flows are permanently altered, China will need alternative energy sources. That could mean increased purchases of American oil and gas, which Trump would love to tout as a win. But it also means China could use energy insecurity as a reason to demand concessions on technology, tariffs, or Taiwan. Everything is connected. Everything is leverage. Now, I want to be fair here. Is not all doom and gloom for the American side. Some analysts argue that the Iran strikes could actually give the United States added leverage by demonstrating military capability and resolve. As one expert from the Center for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies told Radio Free Europe, after Venezuela and now Iran, this may give the United States some added leverage ahead of the April meeting. The argument is that if Chinese planners conclude the U.S. can strike swiftly in one theater while sustaining commitments in another, the deterrent implications for Taiwan become sharper. That is a valid point, but it cuts both ways. China could also look at the Iran situation and conclude that the United States is willing to use military force to achieve its objectives regardless of international law, which only strengthens Beijing's argument for self-reliance and decoupling from American economic influence. The national interest made a fascinating observation that perhaps the most consequential lesson for China lies in the integration of advanced AI systems, cyber operations, and intelligence fusion into modern warfare. If frontier American AI capabilities are operationalized in high-end conflict, China will treat the entire AI stack, from chips to cloud infrastructure to model development, as strategic terrain. In other words, the very technology that made the Iran strikes possible could become the next flashpoint in the U.S.-China rivalry. The bottom line is this. We are watching a pivotal moment in the 21st century struggle between the world's two largest economies. The Paris meeting next week is not just about Boeing planes and soybeans. It is about who sets the rules for global trade, who controls critical technologies, and who has the upper hand when the leaders of these two superpowers sit down face to face at the end of this month. Right now, the momentum is with Beijing. Xi Jinping has been patient, strategic, and disciplined. He has watched the Supreme Court weaken Trump's tariff authority. He has watched the Iran conflict consume American bandwidth. And he has positioned China as the reasonable, stable actor in a world of chaos. The question is whether the Trump administration can reverse this momentum before the Beijing summit. Can Scott Bessent and Jameson Greer walk into that Paris meeting and shift the dynamic? Can they find new leverage now that their most powerful economic weapon has been struck down? Can they negotiate effectively while their country is simultaneously fighting a war in the Middle East? These are the questions that will shape the next chapter of the U.S.-China relationship, and the answers will affect every single one of us. That is all for today, folks. If you found this breakdown valuable, and I really hope you did, please hit that like button. It makes a bigger difference than you think. subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update on these fast-moving stories. And share this video with your friends and family, because understanding what is happening between the United States and China is not optional anymore. It is essential. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Xi Jinping has the upper hand heading into this summit? Or does Trump still have cards to play that we are not seeing? I want to hear from you. Until next time, stay informed, stay sharp, and I will see you in the next one.